Once you get to the point of why I'm a freak, so you don't judge me too quickly or too harshly, I want to put into perspective my talent as a freak and how I used it. If a basketball player is unusually tall and coordinated, or exceptionally coordinated and can jump out of his shoes, society does not condemn him for using his natural talent to make money and entertain the population. Likewise, if someone has the spatial awareness, ability to remain calm, and the self-confidence to become a commercial pilot, we do not judge him or her for using his or her natural abilities to make money and provide safe travel for the public. Against this background, I will tell my story and hope that you will treat me as mercifully as you would a basketball player or an airline pilot. I wasn't a star at anything, although most women would rate my looks as an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. I have the average IQ for a college graduate, and I was never rude to anyone, so I rarely pushed or annoyed people. Otherwise, I considered myself boring and unremarkable, until I found out that I was a freak. From 18 to 22, I had normal social interactions with women and a normal sex life. I almost always brought my sexual partner to climax, and I, myself, could usually get it twice in a session. I rarely picked up women in bars or similar establishments, preferring to meet them through other means and, at least, try to start a relationship. However, about 6 months after my 22nd birthday, I had just returned from a 2-week wilderness trek with a very hot guide named Cheryl, who was sexually aloof and unapproachable, but had a near-perfect female body, and I was more than a little turned on. Given my state of horniness, and since I had just gotten out of a 4-month relationship and had no other good prospects, I went to the local meat market, a place to pick up someone, with one of my buddies. There was a bachelorette party taking place there, and the women present were in an exceptionally good and drunken mood. It's like fishing in a barrel, finding a potential bridesmaid named Susan, who has a 7 face and an 8 body, and who could pass for hot tour guide Cheryl from behind. When I brought Susan to my apartment, I was a little worried that she was so drunk that she could no longer consent, but she assured me, rather vaguely, that this was not the case. To be on the safe side, I even recorded her pleas on my iPhone that she was okay and wanted sex. She looked hornier than the nun on Magic Mike. I ended up fucking her twice in the rear position, because from behind I could fantasize that she was Cheryl, and both times I arrived to grandiose détente. Susan also experienced a violent climax every time, so strong that she could not fake it. I noticed that she was not as flexible and energetic as most of my previous sexual partners, but my fantasies about sex with Cheryl's guide more than made up for it. When Susan practically passed out shortly after the second round, I was a little worried about how drunk she was in terms of consent, but I quickly fell asleep myself. I shouldn't have worried. The next morning, Susan woke up as cheerful as any woman I had ever slept with. The main topic of her conversation was what I had done to her that made her feel better than she had in months. I admit that her comments were a real ego springboard because I never considered myself super stud, but, according to her, he was. Susan lived close enough to me, and I was so deprived of any other great opportunities that I was happy that we became sex buddies. Although not as perky as other women I've had relationships with, she was a more than decent sex partner. She also had one advantage over most women. Every time we have sex, she says that she feels better and therefore is ready to do almost anything to please me. Over the next few months, I had a pleasant, no-strings-attached sexual relationship. I made that clear, and she didn't mind. Susan seemed increasingly energetic, and although her personality wasn't compatible enough with mine for a real romantic relationship, I actually liked her have. Then the moment came when she asked me, "Brian, I know this is a strange question, completely unexpected, but I was wondering if you could come with me to my doctor." "You're not pregnant, are you?" I asked, more irritated than I intended. Before the second session of sex, I asked about birth control, and Susan assured me that there was no problem. "No, not even close. My neurologist would like to talk to you," she answered, stuttering. "Do you go to a neurologist?" I asked in shock. From what little I knew about neuroscientists, they worked on people's brains. "Yes, I have MS," she replied. "What is RS?" I asked. As if quoting Wikipedia, she rattled off something like, "Multiple sclerosis, commonly called MS, is a disabling disease of the brain and spinal cord. The immune system attacks the protective sheath that covers the nerve fibers and causes problems with communication between my brain and the rest of my body. In my case, it can cause muscle spasms, fatigue, lack of balance and coordination, pain, and other problems that I don't want to go into." "How bad is your case?" I continued. "My doctor says average, whatever that means. Sometimes I have no problems, and sometimes they are significant. However," she began, then stopped and looked at the ground. I gently lifted her chin so that she looked into my eyes. "However, what?" I asked. "However, after sex with you, I feel better, and I haven't had a typical bad day with MS since the first night we slept together." I think I almost passed out, and I'm sure my eyes rolled back into my head. Susan looked at me with concern, took my hand and asked, "Are you okay?" After a short pause, I was able to collect my thoughts and answered, "Yes, I think so." "Well," she continued, "when the neurologist saw my progress over the past few months and asked what I was doing differently, I told her about our sexual relationship. She said that sex with you can only be responsible for my progress. That's why she wants to see you." It scared me to death. I started to think I was going to become a lab rat. I didn't know what the laws were regarding doctors' rights to force me to do something I didn't want to do if I had some strange ability, so I replied, "Sorry, I can't do this," and left. Susan called to me behind her, and I turned to look and saw tears streaming down her face, but I continued walking. I hoped this would be the end of it, but it wasn't. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't answer Susan's calls or texts, and avoided her when she came to my apartment twice. I was having a hard time coping with the situation, thinking that maybe I could help, but I was no closer to agreeing to become a lab rat. Then, around 9 o'clock on Friday evening, there was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole to make sure it wasn't Susan, but it wasn't her. It was a woman who at first glance looked mature, but my God, how wonderfully mature she was. Out of curiosity, I opened the door. "Hello," she said with a wide smile. Seeing her without the distortion of her eye and in her full height almost took my breath away. She was probably about 30, but the only number that came to mind was 10, the only 10 I had ever seen in person, other than that wilderness guide, Cheryl, who inspired me to take Susan. She said something else after hello, but since I was fascinated, I didn't hear it. Finally, I woke up and said, "Sorry, I'm a little stunned that someone came to my door and didn't hear you well. Could you repeat what you just said?" She grinned, perhaps used to guys temporarily losing their brain power when they first looked at her, so she patiently repeated what she had apparently said earlier. "I'm Dr. Vivian Hampton, neurologist Susan Bernardo. Mr. Stevens, I know you had a negative reaction to Susan's request to come see me, but the reason I want to see you is important enough for me to seek you out. Can I come in? Vivian Hampton is not a woman who is easy to say no to, or at least it was impossible for me to say no to her, so I stepped aside and invited her in." "Please call me Vivian, and can I call you Brian?" she asked. Of course." "Vivian," I muttered, still slurring my tongue. It didn't help that she sat down across from me and crossed her long, toned, tan legs, causing her knee-length skirt to rise slightly, revealing her more defined hips. "There are 2 things that I would like to discuss with you. I hope you'll agree to at least one, Brian." Okay. What are these things, Vivian?" I was able to squeeze out, but only by turning my gaze from her graceful legs to her equally graceful face. I would like to get a real sense of whether what Susan says is true about the progress she has made with MS. This will require actual experimentation, both objective and subjective, but I hope the experiments I have in mind will be enjoyable for you," she stated with a smile that I would describe as devilish. "And what is the second question?" "I would like to conduct intensive chemical tests on your body secretions and fluids, which would require the services of a pharmaceutical company." she continued with an even larger smile. Well, I don't know about the second one, I answered, starting to sweat. Are you interested in at least hearing about the first one, which will not require any injections or discomfort? She asked, crossing her legs in the opposite direction with a sufficient pause between each crossing. Well, of course, I muttered. First, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to sign a confidentiality agreement. This is to protect me and you, so that none of us divulge information that we should not divulge, she smiled, taking out a couple of copies of a 2-page document from a suitcase that I didn't even notice. I was so engrossed in her beauty. She handed me one copy of the confidentiality agreement and then went through it point by point. It was written in simple language, not legal, so it was quite understandable. It basically said that none of us would reveal to other parties the objective and subjective experiments she was planning. I am not obligated to carry out experiments if I decide not to do so after learning about them, but I could not reveal these details to anyone at any time. There was a penalty clause that provided for a significant monetary penalty if either party violated the agreement, which had to be proven only by a preponderance of the evidence, which she explained to me was a 50.1% chance. I asked if I could call my mother, she's a lawyer, and ask her about it. Of course, Vivian replied. You can do it right now, or I can come back. She's 2 time zones ahead, so it's only 7:20 p.m., so let me try, I replied, pulling out my iPhone. Mom was happy about my call, even when I told her what its main purpose was. I read the agreement to my mom, answered a few questions, and even got Vivian involved to answer the other 2. At the end of the conversation, my mother said that there was nothing wrong with at least finding out the details, if only I could keep the secret. I was assured that I could. After finishing the call, I asked Vivian for a pen, signed and dated both copies, and she did the same. She gave me one copy and put the second in her bag. Then she asked, "Can I reveal the details tonight?" "There's no time like the present," I replied, because it was Friday evening and I had no plans, just like Saturday morning. So even if it took a while, it didn't really matter. Vivian began to outline her plan. "Before I begin, I want to confirm that you are not married or have any current romantic interests, and that there is nothing that prevents you from having sexual relations with others, including the absence of sexually transmitted diseases." "I can confirm that," I answered hesitantly. "Do you mind if I test you for sexually transmitted diseases tomorrow, just for the record, at my expense?" she noted. "No problem," I replied. "Fine. I have quite a few MS patients, more than any other doctor I know, and most of my patients are women. I would like you to conduct a full examination of each patient that we agree on, then have intercourse with him on several occasions in between, and re-examine him after each time. This is the objective part of the test, which I will carefully record." "What?" I exclaimed. "How can they agree to this? Any person with MS is looking for a solution, and I can easily convince half of my eligible patients to agree." She grinned. "What if they are married?" I asked. Sweat was actually rolling down my forehead and pooling under my arms. "We will get permission from our husband, otherwise we won't do this." "What if the patient is not physically attractive to me?" "You will not be required to experiment with someone you do not want to. However, I think you will find that most of the women I recommend are desirable in some way." "Well, maybe—" I hesitated. "That brings me to the subjective part of the experiment," she chuckled, although what she said next was far from humorous. "Ironically, just 2 months ago, I self-diagnosed myself with early-stage multiple sclerosis, which was confirmed by a colleague just a month ago. I would like to subjectively evaluate myself over several months of sexual relations with you. Of course, I will test myself objectively in addition to the subjective assessment. I think the British have a word for my reaction to this: dumbfounded. Or perhaps even that word isn't strong enough. My sweat glands immediately began to flow. Like a river, my breathing became labored and my legs became weak. Thank God I was sitting. A tent formed in my pants. Vivian laughed at my reaction. "I guess you need time to digest everything," she chuckled. Let me give you some more information that you can use in your assessment. With these words, she pulled off her blouse, without a bra, came up to me, and began to caress my manhood. After I climaxed, she pulled her top back into place. A sinister smile appeared on her face, and she said, I'll pick you up tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. to get tested for sexually transmitted diseases so that we can start real experiments before the end of next week. All I could do was nod like an automaton. I had to fight myself, thinking about Vivian's impressive body and utter sexuality, before I could fall asleep. There was no way that I wouldn't go through with the program. Vivian arrived at my apartment right on time, and after just 4 minutes in her Ferrari, we arrived at the testing laboratory. She paid for expedited service and to have both of our results sent to both of our phones. We were told that the results would be ready on Tuesday afternoon. I thought that the fact that I went to get tested for STDs with her would be Vivian's answer to her question about whether I agreed with the first point of her program. However, after turning off the engine in front of my house, she asked, So, Brian, do you agree with my program? The first part, yes, damn it, I smiled. But I still doubt whether it's real. Believe it or not a single woman who answered every 10 I could think of wanted anything to do with me. Thanks for the implied comment, she chuckled. You're belittling yourself, but that's only for science, isn't it? She asked rhetorically before laughing. Then she kissed me on the lips. Not a peck, but as hot as any short kiss in my life. If all goes well, could I bring my toothbrush to your apartment on Tuesday evening, say around 9 o'clock? Damn, this woman doesn't waste any time, I said to myself. He said out loud, Of course on Tuesday at 9 in the evening. That earned me another hot kiss, and then she took off, burning rubber, as I waved goodbye to her. That weekend and Monday I had a hard time concentrating on anything. However, I had an important project at work, so I had to pull my head out of my ass and focus. Everything was going well until around 4 p.m. on Tuesday, when I received an email with the test results. All clear, for both of us. I treated myself to a great dinner, although I ate about half as much as I usually eat to ensure that the food was digested by 9 p.m. Vivian arrived at 9 as promised with a toothbrush and a suitcase for the night. Planting one of her signature hot kisses on my lips, she placed her hands on my shoulders. Brian, today I had a bad day. For the first time since I was diagnosed with MS, I had muscle spasms and unusual fatigue. It is necessary that you banish these symptoms. I barely managed to say, I'll try, before she planted another fiery kiss on my lips and began undoing my zipper. It was the most restraint I had ever shown in my life, not to fuck Vivian immediately, especially since she seemed to be craving it. I started caressing her body. It didn't take me long to get her to the finish line. She experienced such a strong climax that she almost flew off the bed. Having come to her senses, she began to beg for me to take her. I'd never even been on a date with a 10 before, let alone had sex. I was ready. She was cozy, very cozy. She also had excellent control over her muscles. The sight of her heavenly body and face made me reach the finish line faster than any time since I was 18 years old. I was afraid that it had happened prematurely, but at the moment of my finishing, she screamed and trembled. It was the best sex of my life, by a light year. Until this evening, I had never discharged more than twice in a night. That night, and until the next morning, she made me finish 4 times. She was a sex goddess. By the time she left for work at 8:30 a.m., I was so exhausted that I wasn't sure I still had a spine. I was in 7th heaven all day, but my wonderful mood did not distract me from work. It even inspired me. I felt better than ever before. So what if a mature goddess had sex with me because she thought it would help her deal with her multiple sclerosis? She actually had sex with me, so why should I care? My day became even brighter when, shortly before finishing work, the goddess called me on my cell phone. Hey, Brian, she purred with enough sexiness to almost bring me to the edge. I thought you might want to know how I felt today. You're right, goddess, I chuckled. I felt the best I've felt in months. Today, I had no MS symptoms at all. Based on my subjective assessment, I believe that there is something in your semen that, at least temporarily, abolishes the symptoms of MS. Is it true? I became interested. True, she laughed. This brings me to a question. Can't we do a repeat of Tuesday night this Friday? Nothing will make me happier, I answered seriously. Even though we only did it twice on Friday night, it was even better and more intense than Tuesday night. By the time we climaxed, I was practically unconscious while she was screaming my name. Vivian's plan was to experiment, as she put it, 2 or 3 times a week, depending on her schedule, for the next 2 months. And if things progressed, as she subjectively believed so far, she would begin her experiments. By the end of the 2nd month, Vivian swore that she had no symptoms of MS, although there were still markers in her blood, so she was not cured, and every objective test she did on herself showed the same thing. As a professional, she was delighted. I was thrilled too because it meant I could continue having sex with her. However, there was one problem. I fell in love with Vivian. When someone has the face and body of a goddess, has sex like a mink, has a genius IQ, a cheerful and positive personality, and is rich like Croesus, how can any normal guy like me not fall head over heels in love with her? Even though at first I was excited by the fact that I would be getting sex on a regular basis, now I only wanted Vivian, even if she was 17 years older than me. Any 22-year-old would kill to have her body. I felt obligated to tell her about this. On the day when she was supposed to explain to me the details of her experiments, I timidly said, "Vivian, I don't want to ruin your plans, but I have fallen in love with you, and I have no desire to have sex with anyone else. I just don't think I can do it." Vivian smiled wryly and took my hands in hers. "I can't say I really love you, Brian, at least not yet, but I really like you. However, I need you to follow through. This is the most important thing I have done professionally, and it could lead to easing the suffering of hundreds of thousands and, for me, to the selfish satisfaction of some of my life's ambitions." We talked quietly for the next half hour. Finally, it came down to a simple bribe. "If you agree to help me with experiments over the next 2 years, then tomorrow you can move into my apartment." I was stunned. "Of course, in the evening, before you experiment with another woman, we won't be able to have sex," she giggled. It was the first time I heard her giggle. "Could this lead to a long-term relationship, even after the experiments are over?" I asked nervously. "Yes," she beamed, and my heart melted. At that moment, I would do whatever she asked. The details of the experiments were relatively simple. She, after obtaining signatures on a non-disclosure agreement, prepared the women for the experiment, and, if they were married, obtained video and written consent from their husbands. I invited each subject to dinner one evening, to some event during the day, and then we agreed to have sex. At any time before the actual event, both I and the subject could refuse. The subject was also required to be tested for STDs. During the experiment, I bring the subject to climax and then inject her twice. Before and after the experiment, all her vital signs are checked, MRI, blood tests, etc. The experiment is repeated as many times as necessary for Vivian to obtain decent results. Neither the subject nor I could be paid for conducting the experiments, since this could violate the laws on prostitution. Vivian assumed that I would have to do experiments 5 or 6 times a month. I agreed, signed another confidentiality document regarding this, and moved into Vivian's luxurious apartment that same weekend. We tried half the rooms that weekend, but I had to abstain on Monday and Tuesday, since the first sex, provided that everything went well with my communication with the object on Monday and Tuesday, was on Wednesday evening. I think that Vivian chose her first object with special care. June was a very pretty 21-year-old single woman with long blonde hair, cerulean blue eyes, and rather impressive breasts. June was also one of Vivian's neediest patients. She had multiple sclerosis almost from birth. When we went to dinner, I had to walk very slowly for her to keep up with me, and, to her embarrassment, we had to stop regularly during the day's excursion. And on 2 occasions, I even had to massage her calves when June had muscle cramps. Even though I was in love with Vivian, since Vivian had gotten it into my head that this was the best thing I could do to help her, and since June was a passive, inexperienced, beautiful young woman, I had no problem unloading. Before we started, she drank 120 milliliters of 57 proof whiskey to reduce her anxiety. June enjoyed my stimulating caresses so much that before I fucked her for the first time, I pleasured her by taking her to the finish line twice. Although, as I said, she was passive, it was such a significant change from the now wild Vivian that it was a nice change of pace. After the first injection, she was tired and fell asleep, but about an hour later I woke her up and gave her another injection, which seemed to make her very happy. When I experimented with June again 2 weeks later, and then 2 more times 2 weeks apart, she became more and more active and said many times how glad she was that her symptoms had decreased by at least 90%. I know she was disappointed when we had to pause for a year so Vivian could evaluate the long-term effects of my treatment. And I admit that I was a little disappointed too, since all the subjects were not as good-looking and were not as enthusiastically grateful like June. During the first year, I had a few less-than-stellar experiences and one bad one. But overall, I have to say I enjoyed it as most of the subjects were very receptive and appreciative, but I would never have done it if I hadn't had the opportunity to communicate with Vivian at least 3 times a week. My feelings for Vivian deepened, but another problem arose. I suspected that one of the other neurologists in her 5-person practice knew about the experiments and was also partial to Vivian. His name is Ashton Quincy. He's 41 years old and he's arrogant. Vivian assured me that he knew nothing about the experiments, neither did the 3 other neurologists in her practice, all of whom I liked, and that he had no romantic interest in her, and she had no romantic interest in him. However, I used the situation with Ashton to my advantage. After complaining about things for a month, one night after exceptionally vigorous sex, as I lay next to her with a blank stare, Vivian asked, "What happened, Brian?" "Vivian, I want a little security. You know how much I love you. I want to get married." "But honey, I'm 17 years older than you," she said, stroking my face soothingly. "Age is just a number. You look better and act younger, except for your doctor face," I chuckled, "than 99% of 25-year-olds. You know that I'm also a 3-time loser. I've been divorced 3 times, she continued, stroking my face again. I knew about 2 cases. The 3rd time surprised me, but did not frighten me. "It doesn't matter to me," I replied, kissing her on the lips. Shocked, she agreed to marry me. Perhaps this was done so that I could continue experimenting, but I didn't care. We had a small ceremony in front of the Justice of the Peace with only my parents and brother and her sister and brother-in-law in attendance. We postponed our honeymoon until after the experiments, although we paused them for a week and had sex twice every night. The prenuptial agreement we signed, reviewed by my mother, was standard, given that Vivian was rich and I was not. Both my mother and I thought it was fair. I agreed that the experiments would continue for at least another year, and we had a mutual adultery clause with a significant penalty. By the time Vivian and I had been married for about 10 months, and the experiments had been going on for about 22 months, she came to a decision, and strange things began to happen. Because she had received so much promising data, her decision was to stop the experiments after another 8 months, and my participation in them after another 6. I verbally agreed to this on the condition that she would give me a look at what she had discovered so far. Although she did not show all the data, she did learn that, in addition to the poor, progressing subject I alluded to earlier, who did not produce with any worthwhile data, of the 21 subjects for whom she had good data, 100% had a clear improvement in their symptoms. Relief ranged from a 15% reduction in symptoms after 1 experiment to more than 90% relief after at least 3 experiments conducted at intervals ranging from 2 weeks to 2 months. In only 1 subject, whom we called Subject K, the relief of symptoms did not exceed 15%. Not surprisingly, one of the subjects was Susan. She did not feel any resentment. and she had one of the best rates of symptom mitigation. 3 subjects, including June, whom we called Subject A, and Susan, who had 90% plus mitigation and were early participants, still had more than 80% mitigation, even more than a year after the last injection. In Vivian's case, because we had sex at least twice a week, and usually 4 times, her symptoms completely disappeared, although there were still markers in her blood that indicated she wasn't quite cured. Vivian even showed me the first draft of a paper she was going to eventually submit to a medical journal, where I was originally listed as injector, and much of her data was summarized. She found one strange thing. If the subject drank about 60 milliliters of ethanol, not 2 ounces of wine, liquor, or beer, but 2 ounces of the ethanol contained in wine, beer, or liquor, the mitigation effect increased by about 20%. Vivian was very pleased with the results. I was proud of myself because I had actually helped 21 women and had fun doing it. And there was only one complication. One married subject became emotionally attached to me, which led to a breakup with her husband, and they divorced, which is not bad at all for an experiment that lasted more than 2 years. Even though the sex was fun, I honestly only looked forward to, and most of all, sex with Vivian, since she was my best sex partner by far. This is where things started to get weird. First, the asshole Dr. Quincy became an even bigger asshole around me and made suggestive comments to Vivian in my presence, which she seemed to laugh at and beg me not to confront Quincy. Second, 3 times in 6 weeks, when Vivian and I had a bottle of wine on a Friday or Saturday night, I began to doze off while we were watching a movie. Went to bed early because I couldn't keep my eyes open, and when I woke up the next morning, one of my arms was strangely sore. Vivian and I had sex all 3 mornings, and soon I forgot about the discomfort in my hand. Third, Vivian was very secretive about some of the things she did, and would close her laptop or desk drawer, or stop talking on her cell phone whenever I showed up. I don't know what prompted me to do this. Perhaps I was becoming more sophisticated being around Vivian and her friends. But I decided to investigate. I installed 2 voice and motion-activated video cameras in our bedroom, searched the apartment for unusual medications, and installed a locator app on Vivian's phone and Dr. Asshole's phone, which they casually left on their desks while seeing patients in exam rooms or performing surgeries. After completing the preparations, I really hoped I was wrong. The following Friday evening, I pretended to drink the wine Vivian had given me, but deftly threw it away and replaced it with grape juice of the same color. I complained of being tired and dizzy and went to bed early. About 90 minutes later, Vivian and Dr. Kozel entered the room. I pretended to fall into a deep sleep. While Dr. Kozel held my hand, Vivian removed a large tube of blood from it. They chatted about how they would probably now be able to reproduce in my seed the materials that would cause the desired relief of MS symptoms, and that after the experiments were completed, Vivian would abandon me so that I would never learn about the chemical treatment they hoped to develop. After they removed the test tube, Goat began kissing Vivian. "Let's have sex in your bed again, and the comatose freak will be next to us," cackled the asshole. "Why does this excite you so much?" Vivian giggled. "Because it shows how superior I am to freak. That's why," he chuckled. Then I heard giggling and moaning, and the mattress began to bounce. I knew the best course of action was to continue pretending I was in a coma, but I just couldn't bear it. I was thinking about what I could do that wouldn't land me in jail, but would be very unpleasant for my bedmates, when it dawned on me. Those bastards were too busy to notice that I quietly got out of bed, went to the bathroom, and grabbed the carbon dioxide fire extinguisher that was there. Anyone familiar with these fire extinguishers knows that they don't just put out fires, they also cool them down. If you get sprayed by a fire extinguisher like this, it's almost like putting dry ice on your skin. Just when assholes seemed ready to explode, I hit them with the first, then the second, then the third blast from the fire extinguisher. I was careful not to hit them with enough CO2 to permanently damage their skin, but judging by how loud they screamed and how quickly the asshole rolled off my wife, he was hurting like a son of a bitch. While they were running around, still screaming and moaning, I took out a vial of my blood without leaving my fingerprints on it. There was no need to worry about cameras, since they were recorded onto a computer DVD in my office. "We'll talk about the terms of the divorce tomorrow, you cheating bitch," I growled, leaving the room. "You've had sex with over a dozen women since we got married, you idiot. How dare you call me a cheater?" Vivian screamed, finally recovering from the effects of carbon dioxide. "There's a big difference, dear wife," I chuckled. "You asked me to have sex with them, and the last thing I'm willing to put up with is you having that pompous ass." With that, I charged at Dr. Asshole with my fist raised, and he cowered in the corner like the coward that he was. I just laughed at him and left. The next day, Vivian and I had an unproductive conversation. There were no apologies on her part, only a sense of superiority. She still didn't know about the DVD from the previous night. My mom connected me with the hottest lawyer in our city, and I hired him and his partner after talking with them for 15 minutes. They looked like predatory sharks. Apparently, she told Dr. Asshole about the experiment, so I sued Vivian for violating our confidentiality agreement, assault for taking my blood without my permission, fraud for attempting to develop a treatment using my blood and my semen without my input, and divorce for adultery using the cheating in our marriage contract. The papers handed to her just 2 days after my meeting with the lawyers included draft complaints to the Council of Medical Ethics. That is, petitions in which she and Dr. Asshole were named as respondents. We had not filed complaints yet. They were just to let them know what will happen if they do not cooperate. To speed up the process, we've even included a copy of the DVD. 2 days after filing the complaint, Vivian came to my condominium guest room. We were still living in the same condominium, but we were not sleeping together or communicating. She wasn't like her usual confident, brash self. "Brian, can I talk to you about lawsuits? Just between us, without lawyers?" she asked politely. "Of course," I answered. "If you answer one question." "Okay," she answered hesitantly. "Have you ever loved me?" She paused. She didn't know what I knew. If she's lying or nervous, she'll have a rapid left eye flutter of which she's unaware. When answering me, she did not show this sign. "No, I never loved you, but then again, I didn't love 2 of my 3 husbands. However, I like you more than my other 3 husbands, even the one I loved. No, that doesn't make much sense, especially considering what's on the DVD. Although it's a terrible cliché, it's my problem, not yours. I know that you really loved me, and I feel regret, perhaps even guilt." I was surprised by her frankness. "Thank you for your honest answer," I replied. "Now, what do you want to talk about?" "Can we go to the kitchen?" she asked. "I have several papers laid out on the table there." I was surprised at how quickly we came to an agreement, in less than 2 hours. She paid me the fine required by the confidentiality agreement, paid the adultery fine required by the prenuptial agreement, paid me $100,000 for the assault, agreed that if she developed an effective treatment, she would give me 20% of the profits, and split everything by how much the total increased fortune after our marriage, which had more to do with her income than mine, was 50-50. She also agreed in writing that I would not violate the confidentiality agreement if I told anyone about this with whom I would be romantically involved. Relationship. Finally, she agreed to convince Dr. Goat to pay me $100,000 for the assault claim against him. Neither of us will contest the divorce, and she will pay my attorney fees. I have agreed to never report any of her or Asshole's activities to anyone else, including medical ethics boards and law enforcement, and to assign to her all rights I have, other than compensation, to any treatment for MS if one is ever developed. When we finished, even after writing and signing everything we agreed to, she demonically said, "I would like to receive the last injection from you." "With pleasure," I grinned, "but not before the divorce becomes final. Even though I kind of trust you, my lawyer says sex could be construed as reconciliation, and I don't know how that will affect our agreement." "I understand," she smiled. "However, That doesn't stop you from kissing or groping me, does it? I actually kissed her passionately, but didn't touch her with my hands because that would have taken me over the edge. By the time the divorce was final, Vivian and I had our last night together. It was emotionally bittersweet, but, as always, extremely physically pleasurable. I had more money than I ever expected to have in my life. I left my job with the intention of starting my own business after a 6-month or so holiday. The one thing I knew would get me moving again was another hike in the wild. I even dreamed that Cheryl would still work as a guide and change her attitude towards me. Cheryl was still working for the same company, and, as luck would have it, she and the male guide were putting together another group, the last one, before she left the company. I signed up as soon as I heard about it, and within a week, I was at the company headquarters with all my equipment. My pride rose greatly when I was introduced, and she, looking into my eyes, said, "You're Brian, aren't you? Didn't I take you on an adventure about 3 years ago?" "Actually, yes, Cheryl," I chuckled. "Was I really so clumsy that you remembered me?" "Perhaps," she laughed. Cheryl was so much friendlier and more approachable than the first time that I had to ask the male guide about it. 2 or 3 years ago, she was in a relationship and couldn't stand guys who hit on her. Now she's no longer in a relationship and doesn't mind polite advances. He chuckled. With Cheryl's new attitude and my increased self-confidence, given everything that had happened to me over the past 3 years, we seemed to hit it off. However, a problem arose. After 3 days of our journey, Cheryl stumbled several times. Fortunately, either myself or the male guide managed to catch her before she fell to the ground. In addition, at night, she complained of fatigue. This was not like Cheryl, who led my first wildlife tour. On the 3rd night, when she complained of being tired, I asked to talk to her one-on-one. "Cheryl, your fatigue and stumbling really bother me," I began. "I'm sure it's just a virus or something like that." She waved off my comment. "Since I last saw you, I have been working with neurologists most of the time and have learned a lot about diseases whose symptoms include fatigue and stumbling. In fact, I think we should call a helicopter and I'll go with you to the neurologist," I said seriously. She again tried to laugh it off, but after another 15 minutes of conversation, she agreed that if she didn't feel better by noon the next day, she would do what I advised her. When Cheryl almost fell off a cliff at 10 o'clock the next morning if I hadn't caught her, my male guide and I insisted that she be evacuated. He called a helicopter, and when it arrived, I demanded that I accompany her. Back at headquarters, I asked Cheryl to grab a few changes of clothes and then drove her to the nearest big city. Working with and around Vivian, I learned who the top neurologists were on the East Coast, and by calling names and pleading, I was able to get an appointment with one of the best within 2 days. In the meantime, I got us 2 hotel rooms, insisting on payment despite her protests, and we went for checkups when she wasn't tired. I sat in the waiting room while Cheryl had an appointment with the neurologist. Unfortunately, I was right about her condition. The doctor said she had multiple sclerosis. When we left the doctor's office, Cheryl was crying. Between tears, she asked, "Is this what you expected?" Unfortunately, yes. I didn't want to tell you until it was confirmed, but I've been working with MS patients for over 2 years, and you have classic symptoms. But there is also a positive side. "Which?" She jumped up. "Let's go back to your room and I'll tell you," I said. While we got to the hotel, Cheryl was silent. Then I sent her to her room and told her I would be back in 5 minutes with information that would cheer her up. Maybe, or maybe not, that's how I put it. When I returned to Cheryl's room, I had with me a copy of the first draft of the article Vivian had written for publication in a medical journal. I showed it to Cheryl and asked her to read it. Cheryl read it, but I noticed that she was confused. I read along with her, explaining each part in detail. When he finished, she realized what was written there, but asked, "What does this have to do with me?" The guy who is veiledly called Injector in the article is me. After a pause, she snapped, "Listen, Brian, I've had almost every guy try to get into my pants, but this shit tops them all." "Nonsense, right?" I grinned. "Would you believe the author?" She nodded, but didn't answer. I took out my cell phone and called Vivian's number. The call went to voicemail. I called her office and told receptionist D with whom I had a good working relationship, that I needed to speak to Dr. Vivian Hampton ASAP. I only gave her full name for Cheryl's sake. Dee replied that she had a patient, but she would probably be done in 5 minutes. Dee promised that she would call me back right away. After finishing my conversation with Dee, I turned to Cheryl and said, "When Dr. Hampton calls back, I want you to first ask her the biographical questions in the preamble to the article to make sure it's her. Then I want you to ask her specific questions about the statements in the draft article. Once you're sure it's her, I want you to ask her who the injector is." For the next 5 to 10 minutes, Cheryl and I didn't speak as she looked through the article, and then Vivian called. "Hi, Dr. Hampton," I answered the call. "Thank you for calling." After briefly describing the situation to her, I handed the phone to Cheryl. She asked all the questions I suggested and, having received answers to them, said weakly, "Thank you, Dr. Hampton," and handed the phone back to me. I also thanked Vivian and ended the call. Cheryl looked into my eyes. "This is not nonsense, is it?" "No, Cheryl, I swear, this is not nonsense. It's all true," I replied. A faint smile appeared on her face and she began to undress. About 2 years after my first exciting sexual experience with Cheryl, I received a call from Vivian. At this point, Cheryl and I had been married for about 18 months and were expecting our first child. I was happy. How many guys can marry 2 10-point women in their lives? And I actually expected that I would be married to this 10 for the rest of my days. Vivian called to say that the MS pills she was working on using my blood and semen were only marginally successful, relieving about 10–15% of the symptoms. Not bad, but not a panacea. The drug was too expensive to produce given its limited success, so in the end, neither of us would make much money. To my surprise, although perhaps wrongly so, Vivian asked if we could meet up and do a couple of sessions for old time's sake, since her MS symptoms were only 25% reduced. I politely declined, thanked her for the call, and didn't expect to hear anything else about her. I was not at all surprised that Vivian's treatment failed. You see, I knew something that I never told Vivian. The reason Subject K performed so poorly in our experiments was because when we had sex, she did not climax. I was confident that any chemicals that were introduced into my family, and likely into the ethanol consumed by the subject, were somehow altered by the chemicals released or consumed when the subject climaxed, and without a corresponding climax, the results were not as good. "What was that call?" my beautiful busty wife asked me as soon as I finished the conversation. Before Cheryl and I got married, she was 100% symptom-free, and to be completely honest, I told her that Vivian and I were once married, so she could understand the reason for her calling. I turned to Cheryl with a big smile on my face, gently stroked her belly, and then said, "Dr. Hampton thinks you need another injection, and right now." "You're an animal," she giggled. "God, it's great to be a freak." Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.